Shakespeare in the future is what we're getting from Peter Tate, fifth person singular. Yeah, it's alright. Shakespearean romance. I don't know much about Shakespeare apart from what I was made to do in school, but I was quite proud of myself for realizing Tate was doing a Shakespearean thing before he started laying it on thick with the Shakespeare references. Like, "No, merry wife of Windsor thee," he said nonsensically. She regarded him strangely. I do like that it's perfectly acceptable in science fiction to wear your influences very much on your sleeves. It's quite cute, really. But yeah, I mean, it's not in Elizabethan English, which, you know, maybe it should have been. Maybe he should have gone whole hog, you know? I think Tate didn't want to be too obvious with it, because apart from mentioning Shakespeare every other paragraph in the second half of the story, it's not a retelling of a Shakespeare story, which I think, you know, when you hear something's doing Shakespeare, it's usually a retelling of a Shakespeare play, right? Like The Forbidden Planet is a retelling of The Tempest, which is everyone's favorite science fiction example of Shakespeare. Or How to Lose a Guy in 10... Is it How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days? Or 10 Things I Hate About You? I think it's 10 Things I Hate About You. Probably shouldn't be getting those mixed up. I haven't seen either of them. But yeah, rom-coms. Shakespeare invented the modern rom-com. That's my controversial take. It's probably not even controversial. But yeah, the story was fine. It was fine. An older woman is trying to get laid with a younger guy by a canal. Pretty much it. He's a poet. They're all poets. They're all poets in the new wave. Gotta have a poet in there somewhere. Otherwise, how could we possibly know they're trying to be literary? I'm trying to think of how this is actually science fiction or speculative fiction or whatever, apart from the fact that they have names like Spear Shack and Arn. That's always a giveaway. But it's alluded to that there's population control, which is my least favorite science fiction trope, but it was on everyone's minds in the 70s, still on a lot of people's minds. Like, I used to think, oh, population, because like people throw some big numbers at you and shout the name Malthus and suddenly you're paying attention, but it's skin deep. It's not a real issue compared to the exploitative practices of capitalism that are destroying the planet, you know. And something people never talk about is it's an issue that will recur if you don't fix the system that is destroying the planet. Then it doesn't matter whether you've got a high population or a low population, you'll have a high population at some point. I don't know. It's dumb. It's dumb. And it's another reason I don't want to read John Brunner. John Brunner is my enemy. But yeah, this was fine. I didn't really like it when Tate cited the woman's motivation being the anticipation in her empty womb. Nah. He had a nice bit here about like pure aesthetics. "What did she know of aesthetes?" he asked. "I know they can call a thing beautiful without ever knowing that thing," she said. "That they echo like empty vessels when tapped. At 18, a youth may bind some words together for effect. At 25, he will know there is no effect, that making the words look pretty was just one way of avoiding the fact that he does not know what they mean. A child's charcoal drawing portrays toadstools as big as people. What happens as the child ages? Does he grow larger or the toadstools smaller?" I quite like that. Unfortunately, I do feel like that applies to the rest of the story. It feels like a lot of pretty, relatively empty words. It's quite overly sentimental, quite saccharine. I imagine this will have very little staying power with me. But I did appreciate what Tate was trying to do. I think having people in the future talk in quite a stuffy way is a much better alternative to future slang, you know? Aldous did that quite well in the first New Worlds. But that story was saved for me by the horrible predatory cars. It had an edge to it, you know. This didn't really have an edge. It was just quite melancholy and solipsistic. So Peter Tate's Welsh. I'm quite happy to see that the English movement is not entirely formed of English people, which fits to most things referred to as English. Apparently Tate wrote a book about Welsh separatists discovering a US cache of nerve gas in the Brecon Beacons, and I am quite tempted to read that. No one else is going to write that book. I have actually read the next one and the story after that because I was too tired to record the past few days. Been very sleepy. So Listen Love, again, very sparse on the illustration front. Listen Love by George Zebrowski and Jack Dann. These are two authors I know nothing about. It seems they had relatively big careers, but I just haven't heard of them myself. I think Jack Dann might mostly be well known for his anthologies, and Zebrowski wrote some Stapleton-esque book called Macro Life, which sounds like it could either be quite interesting or the most irritating thing I've ever read. So I might have to read that to find out. This was well written, I thought. I did prefer this to the last one. It had quite nice alien nature writing in, which caught my eye. It's very short. It's 3 pages. It's quite a simple idea story, you know, like, I mean, I'm not really ruining it. It's basically, what if human speech sounded like agonizing screams of pain to an alien species? And what if that got in the way of us getting laid in space? That's basically it. I didn't really like the fragile indigenous woman who's very in tune with nature. It feels quite trite and a bit dodgy, but yeah, it was fine. The writing was good, and even if the content was a bit, you know, so, I am up for reading more Zebrowski and Dann in the future, wherever they may appear. I will not be hunting their stuff down as a result of this story, though. Then I read, hello, big illustration, Feathers of the Wing of an Angel, Feathers from the Wing of an Angel by Thomas M. Disch. I'm fairly confident when I encounter Disch now that I'm going to be in for a good time, and I was not wrong. This was great. It's a really nice satire on the overly sentimental story that glorifies downtrodden poor people, you know? Like, this guy who's a miner who's been laid off has a wife who's sick and he can't afford the medicine to treat her, and his daughter is blind, but there is surgery that could fix it, but again, he doesn't have the money. And so he puts all of his hopes in writing a story and submitting it to a contest at Life magazine, hoping to get the $10,000 prize. And his wife, almost as if spoken to by angels, is like, you must do it. You have to do it, Tom. The main character is Tom, which again, I love. Then we see this very cynical Time magazine editor who throws the manuscript immediately in the bin because it's handwritten, and he assumes full of spelling errors. And then his wife reads it and it touches her heart. You know the rest. Disch is so good at adopting the perfect tone and then just going half a step too far, to the point where it's really funny. And I felt bad laughing at parts of this, but it was funny. This isn't the first story I've read by Disch which involves a destitute character. I know Disch often struggled for money. I think he has real sympathy for characters like that. And what he's taken the piss off here isn't the poor family, it's not their hope, it's the story itself. The fact that stories like this are sold to the middle class who love them, because there's nothing more the middle class loves than the story of a downtrodden person who, through good fortune, comes to better circumstances. I read this just after reading that Observer article about the Salt Path, that walking memoir book that has been on every bookshop shelf in the country, and how, despite it being a true story, a lot of it is embellished, and it turns out the reason they were in a bad situation was because Raina Wynn, i.e. Sally Walker, was embezzling large amounts of money from her old business. They took a loan out to pay the money back when they were found out, which was secured against a house, and they couldn't pay that back, and so the house was going to be taken away. And the first rendition of The Salt Path was self-published and sold as a raffle, where people had a chance to win their house without a mortgage when they hadn't paid off their mortgage and they had this loan secured against their house. So they had no right to do that. It's the perfect example of selling hope, right? They were selling hope in this raffle. The story itself of this walk is selling hope because her husband supposedly has corticobasal degeneration. Maybe he does, but considering how dodgy the rest of the story is, and the fact that if he has CBD, he has had that disease for the longest of any individual with the disease, it rings alarm bells, right? And yeah, I feel like all of that is hidden behind the text here with Disch. There's no twist at the end. He just follows it through to its conclusion, and I think it's better for it. If it had like a cheap satirical twist, I think that would ruin it. But instead, I did have to keep thinking about it and thinking about how it was satire. And it takes it back to Harrison, right, which with his anti-ideology thing. And this is the element of that which I am fully on board with, which is you shouldn't fully embroil yourself in fantasy. You shouldn't buy the fantasies that are sold to you. You shouldn't consume them wholesale. I think the lesson there is, and it's happened so many times, you know, the Salt Path is just the latest one. Always beware people selling you a true story, because a true story is always just fiction that's insincere. Some more so than others, but yeah, there's no such thing as non-fiction, you know, that whole thing. So yeah, I liked that. That was great. There's a nice little tailpiece illustration there as well. Nice illustrations, Claire Morel. Okay, so 3 more stories to go, and then another critical essay from M. John Harrison, which I am really looking forward to. So next up, we've got Monitor, Found in Orbit by Michael Coney. That's a name I know, but again, know nothing about. So yeah, interested to see what Michael Coney is about. Cool. Hope you're good, by the way. I didn't ask. Yeah, how are you? You alright? I'm okay. It's good to get the pleasantries done, isn't it? Anyway, Monitor, Michael Coney. Alright, Michael Coney is pretty good. This was, while I was reading this was one of my favourite stories of the collection, but it did lose me at the end, unfortunately. It was just a little bit too obvious. I thought it was really well written. He's doing a few things with form that's quite interesting. He's not using capital letters, and there's no speech marks. And the speech of other characters than the first person narrator is given in parentheses, which to a certain extent, what does this stuff matter? You know, it's just grammar or whatever. But I did like the feeling of other characters' speech being in brackets made it feel a little bit more ghostly, like it was only just getting through to the consciousness of the main character. Really liked it. For a young guy writing an old character, I thought he did that quite well. Sometimes that can be a bit like cringeworthy, but it was good. Really good. And he's trapped in his memories. He's got a a lot of regrets about his non-relationship with his son, basically. He keeps thinking on these memories of him and his son when his son was a young boy, but it's been like 40 years. And when he finally meets his son can't remember any of this stuff. So the only time him and his son shared, his son doesn't even remember. I thought all that stuff was amazing. Really loved it. I'm definitely checking out Michael Coney. There's not much to spoil, but I am going to try. So, skip ahead if you don't want that. The big bad guys in this are the Stasi. They are a very easy bad guy to have. Obviously, the Stasi and the whole surveillance state of the DDR are indefensible. But it just felt a bit obvious. The main character was thinking the whole time about the son working in the DDR and how his life must be completely controlled and all this. I really thought Coney was setting the reader up for a reveal that actually it's the main character who's been screwed over by the British state. He's got this horrible injury from working in a lab, and I thought that would have been more interesting, mainly in terms of this fiction, and also something like the Stasi, authoritarianism in any form. It isn't permanently connected to certain states. It can happen anywhere, including your own. I thought that would have been a bit more of an interesting commentary rather than, look at that country, look how screwed up they are. Ours is fine, obviously. But yeah, it was really good. It was really well written. Definitely interested in checking out some more Coney. The longer the Peter Tate story sits with me, the more I want to check him out as well. Then they're two potentially interesting writers that I hadn't heard of at all before I read this. So I'm really excited about that. So yeah, that was Michael Coney's story. Very good. For the most part, just lost it a bit at the very end. I think there was a bit of wasted potential, but it was, he was trying something out. The formal experimentation worked pretty well. There were the occasional missing linking word in that sort of stream of consciousness style that maybe it would just read a bit more smoothly if they were put in, but that's just being picky, really. It doesn't matter. I might read a bit of this one, actually, because some of the prose was really good. There is something ecclesiastic about Brixham Abide With Me and the Salvation Army relentless dreary tunes on the Sunday afternoon quayside. Noticeable at midnight too, the air of sleeping sanctity and almost complete silence apart from the occasional priestly caterwaul and the slap-slap of the dirty old water on the young boat's bottoms. Very little light, but a few masthead stars point at me across the reflective water like trained lasers as I turn left following the quay to the steps up to Berryhead Road. Jumping at every cat now, stomach tense as yet another subtle shadow eases from a doorway like black polished shoes. I don't know whether to flit like them from door to door or walk boldly. Soles clapping forthrightly on the road like a hard-working GP strolling home from a nearby night call. I know I am failing. I am striking a too conspicuous compromise between two acceptable modes of behaviour. But you said Uphams at midnight and didn't say how. I mean, is this supposed to be a secret rendezvous or not? God damn it. You might at least have given me some inkling of what's going on. A GP strolling home from a night call? That sounds luxurious. What a different world this was written in. That reminds me, near the start, Coney references aging hippies. This is like a near future story. Love that. I guess it was fairly obvious at the time that there were going to be aging hippies in 1971. Very funny that he incorporates that into the story. Okay, next up, Pandora's Bust, Richard A. Pollack. This one's got an illustration. Angel Cops. Cool. All right, Angel Cop story coming up. Okay, so I wouldn't say that's the worst story I've ever read, but I didn't think it was very good. First thing of note to mention is that Richard A. Pollack is actually Rachel Pollack, who is most well known for writing books about tarot and also the comic series Doom Patrol, which is a great combination of things to be known for, I must admit. I don't know anything about tarot or comics, but I do find both kind of interesting. The whole narrative stimulating symbology of tarot seems kind of cool, and all I know about Doom Patrol is it's apparently what the X-Men ripped off. I picked up an issue of 2000 AD in the charity shop recently and had one of those just missed out moments where the guy behind the till was like, oh, you should have come in yesterday, someone dropped off their whole collection, this is the only one that's left. It's like, oh my god, I would have liked to have them all. I've been slowly making my way through the Incal, which I have very mixed thoughts on. I really like Mobius's artwork. Jodorowsky's writing, maybe not so much, but this kind of wacky, I don't know, I mean cartoonish is the word, right? And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I guess kind of whimsical, lots of stuff happening, not necessarily completely making sense. There's like a loose feeling of reality to it. It does suit comic books quite well, and that's what this story had. Yeah, I'm not going to judge an author by their first published short story, which this was. Same for William Woodrow, although William Woodrow's was worse because it was also not great but still boring, whereas this definitely wasn't boring. The whole thing about the Virgin Mary actually being obsessed with sex, yeah, that's alright, I guess. I don't know. The race stuff wasn't great. It was a bit embarrassing. It's not racist, but it is a bit cringe, like some of the stuff in there. Yeah, seems like a really interesting person. I actually watched a YouTube video of her put up by Arts University Plymouth talking about transgender and tarot, and it was fascinating. She seemed really lovely and earnest, you know. She's apparently written loads of stuff. She won an Arthur C. Clarke Award for, cannot remember the name, Unquenchable Fire. John Clute had good things to say about that on his website. So yeah, that might be worth checking out. I'm definitely not put off by not being a huge fan of this story. In that video, she actually mentions 1971 being an important year for her because she sold her first story to Michael Moorcock and also transitioned, although it wasn't called Transition then, you know. Yeah, she seems like a really interesting character. I will definitely keep an eye out for her. This story didn't really do it for me. That's all I got to say, really. The only other thing was in the story, they go to the World Trade Center, which is an empty ruin. And I just thought that was quite an interesting image. And the character keeps thinking, actually, the building isn't there. It's an illusion. It caught my eye as a little artifact of pre-2001. Yeah, so that is the penultimate story in the collection. What have we got next? The Key of the Door. Arthur Sellings. Arthur Sellings. I don't know anything about him, but that name is familiar. I feel like I've seen people talk about him online, but could be wrong. Oh, I just saw in the bio at the end that Arthur Sellings died suddenly of a heart attack in 1968. A fine craftsman, his work was admired greatly by his fellow writers. He is the author of several novels, including The Power of X, serialized in New Worlds as The Power of Y. Okay. And Junk Day, reviewed in the previous New Worlds Quarterly, a comparatively young man, he left a widow and many friends. That's sad. That reminds me as well that Rachel Pollack died recently, well, a couple of years ago, of cancer. I saw there was a big GoFundMe campaign, and that's always sad, right? When you see a website that was made for like startups just regularly used for medical bills now. Anyway, I'm getting distracted by the bios. The Key of the Door, Arthur Selling's last story. Here we go. I was just flipping through some of the books I picked up in the last video, and Patricia Kennealy's author bio was of note. Kennealy was born in Brooklyn and grew up in North Babylon, New York. She was educated at St. Bonaventure University and Harper College, taking her degree in English literature. For 3 years, she was the editor-in-chief of Jazz and Pop magazine, a national publication devoted to rock and progressive music in the late 60s and 70s. She has written extensively in the field of rock criticism. She is an award-winning advertising copywriter, a former record company executive, and a member of Mensa. Always a good sign when you get the Mensa drop. In 1970, she exchanged vows with the late Jim Morrison, leader of The Doors, in a private religious ceremony. Her leisure pursuits include riding, fencing, and playing the violin. She lives in New York City. Really weird way to say she married Jim Morrison, right? When did he die? It says on his Wikipedia his partner was Pamela Courson, 1965 to 71. Wait, is that... What's going on here? Like... Okay, if you look up Patricia Kennealy, she actually goes by Patricia Kennealy Morrison. Wrote The Celtiad and murder mystery novels. Also, we got another mention of Mensa on her Wikipedia page. She died 2021. Come on, are you not going to talk about... It feels like she's made a big deal out of the Morrison thing. Kennealy and Morrison exchanged vows in a Celtic hand-fasting ceremony in June 1970. They signed a document declaring themselves wed. Isn't this fun? Why go on Wikipedia when you can have it read to you by me? Relationship continued to be long distance, which she said suited them both just fine. June 1970. Okay, married for a year, which was all long distance, and then she kept his name, which I'm sure was a great hindrance to her rock journalism career. Massive alarm bells. Still weirdly tempted to read this book about Celts in space. Anyway, here we come to the end. Yeah, key to the door. The key of the door. Arthur Sellings. I really don't have much to say about this. It's time travel story. A guy finds his son is stealing his time travel machine and going to the future. And yeah, time travel is not one of my favorite subgenres. Like any subgenre or genre, whatever, there's always going to be a good example somewhere. Read half of Woman on the Edge of Time and thought it was quite cool, but also I really wasn't in the right place to read it at the time. I need to go back and finish it. That feels like it's doing something cool with time travel, you know, using it to kind of put a political lens on the present. Whereas The Key of the Door, this is something akin to doing a Sudoku in reading this sort of story, you know, seeing how things slot into place, and it's as interesting as that sounds. Yeah, that's it. Moving on. Always such a treat to have M. John Harrison critical essay in the back. It's something that is really attractive about these New Worlds Quarterlies is There's one in every issue. Reliably polemic, but also extremely thoughtful. Let's see if you can tell who he's talking about here. It isn't his fault, but when a book is claimed as a cure for everything, from materialism to inelegant grammar by oracles as far divorced as Haight-Ashbury and Cambridge, one feels entitled to jib a little. That's right, he's got Tolkien in the crosshairs. I think it's really important, maybe I said this before, I can't remember, but the New Wave is constantly talked about as a purely science fiction movement, but half of the writers in New Worlds are doing fantasy or horror, drifting into weird fiction, and Harrison and Disch both went in the direction of weird fiction and horror. The New Wave exists in all of those genres, for sure. And often, people talk about the new weird in the 2000s, which a lot of it mainly seems to be urban fantasy with slightly Lovecraftian influences or whatever, but the real new weird is Harrison, M. John Harrison, stuff like Things That Never Happen, or like Thomas Ligotti, Brian Evanson. They're reinvigorating weird fiction, Horror definitely isn't my area of expertise or anything. It's just something I'm more and more attracted to, I think. I think that's where a lot of the interesting stuff migrated from science fiction in the latter half of the 20th century. But yeah, Lord of the Rings is, I mentioned before, I was really into it as a kid, but I do struggle with it a bit these days. And not just because, social media is absolutely filled with, did you know actually in the appendices, Pippin and Merry left the Shire to go and see Aragorn and then blah, blah. I don't give a shit, I don't care. It's lore, and I think that is why Tolkien is the perfect enemy to Harrison, is he's against myth-making, mythology. And that was exactly what Tolkien did, very successfully. He invented an English myth. It's become an Anglophone myth. Everyone knows the story of the little hobbit who took the ring to the volcano and whatever. It's a modern myth. And the lore is almost more important than the writing, You never really hear Tolkien quoted for the elegance of the prose or whatever. And the writing's fine, he's a fairly good writer. Although Harrison does take shot at how he glosses over the details of the violence. And it's how can you have heroic fantasy when the battles are just kind of glossed over? And that is kind of troubling, right? Just having heroes, but, these heroic figures are meant to be heroic because of the violence they're able to enact, in the name of nobility or whatever. But, if you're not looking at that violence, then you're only getting half the picture. And, yeah, I get it. It's fantasy. It's not, meant to be realist or whatever, and that's fine. And I think there is a place for this sort of fantasy. I've been dipping into the worm Ouroboros, and I feel like that's a really good example of this. It's not doing character work. The characters in the story are representative of emotions like righteous anger and that sort of thing. They do make for good myths, but not necessarily great literature. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. But I think as well, I'm old now. Anyone who's watching this who's older than me will be rolling their eyes. But I feel old. I wouldn't consider myself a young guy anymore. I do get the sense that as you get older, you're more attracted, or I am anyway, I'm more attracted to literature where even if you're reading it to escape or whatever, and I do that, I definitely need to escape. That's part of the reason I read. I'm not gonna pretend I'm not doing that. Who doesn't need to escape this reality every now and again? Le Guin say something. She said that, but with better words. I do find I'm more attracted to the literature where you see evidence of real life experience in the text and you connect with it because you've lived those experiences. You know, and the longer you live, the more experiences you have, and the more attracted to that sort of thing you are. I think that's why Lord of the Rings is really good young adult literature or whatever, because I really don't want to be lumping people in categories. I'm just saying how I felt, how my tastes have changed, you know. Harrison is taking aim at the sort of fantasy that doesn't have any element of realism to connect to the reader. Fantasy performs different operations on different readers. It may supply what Tolkien calls recovery, or provide the one-off Chestertonian insight, liberate the Jungian archetypes, or merely liven up a train journey, but it can't achieve any of these ends without being, in overall effect and basic supposition, fantastic. The Lord of the Rings is certainly that. However, since any such work is essentially a bridge between the reader's experience and a set of suppositions of which he can have no experience at all, its terms of presentation, if they are to be effective, must be realistic, that is, must relate somehow to instances conceivably within the reader's own experience. And then he gives an example of how the boy in Great Expectations having a rich benefactor who happens to be the convict he helps is ridiculous fantasy, but it is also very much grounded in the Dickensian reality of the time. It's a true boyhood fantasy, you know. What if you had a rich benefactor who get you out of the slums or whatever, get you out of the workhouse? And Harrison's really complimentary to Mervyn Peake and also James Branch Cabell. Is that the name? James Branch Cabell, who I'd never heard of. So I'm interested in checking him out. These authors write characters who are relatable in some way, or their motivations are recognizable from our human experience, and that can make it more compelling. And I agree, you know, that's the stuff I think I've been more into now, but that doesn't mean I'm not into at some point reading this more kind of mythological fantasy, this where I've seen people describe it online, this sort of fiction where the psychological interiority of the characters isn't a priority because the whole epic is meant to be a metaphor for like internal conflict, which there's something in that for sure, but sometimes those interpretations can gloss over uncomfortable aspects in the fiction, like orcs having a people, an entire race that are irredeemable, you know, even if they have one line where they're like, oh, I just want to go home and start a farm or whatever. That's not really how they're portrayed all the way through. They're cannon fodder, which is troubling, right? And Tolkien was really against the idea of anyone reading any allegory into Lord of the Rings, which is very funny to just be like, just take it as it is. Just take the surface level, which is the opposite of that take, right? Some people are favoring the whole thing as a metaphor for internal conflict. And I can't help but feel sometimes that Tolkien had that leaning because the allegory is overly simple and quite an uncomfortable one in places, like with the orcs and the dehumanization of the other, but also the whole World War II thing. Obviously, there are parallels to World War II. And just because Tolkien says, don't read into that, that doesn't mean we shouldn't. Obviously, there are, you know, Tolkien fought in the war, he was influenced by that. And what makes Lord of the Rings more uncomfortable for me these days, I watched the first two films, me and my wife were sick, and we stuck them on. Like, you know, 10 years ago, we would stick on the extended editions while nursing a hangover. And it was almost like the longer and more drawn out this experience, the better, which I've never fully been on board with. But yeah, we rewatched the first couple of films, and I did really enjoy Two Towers has always been my favourite film and book. It's been so long since I read the books, I can barely remember them. It's been like 24 years. Oh my God. Oh my God. That's terrifying. And I have a heavy amount of nostalgia, which I'm very aware of. I enjoyed The Fellowship more this time. I think Peter Jackson was really leaning into the horror elements, because he was doing like schlocky B-movie horror before, right? And that works really well. And I think it's the same with science fiction. I think my favorite science fiction and fantasy tends to lean into horror. That sense of awe they talk about, that's what people are chasing with science fiction or whatever. You get a more intense feeling of awe when you get closer to horror, right? And which the Catholic Church understood for thousands of years. So, what was I saying? Something that I find more uncomfortable these days is the depiction of the Shire, which is obviously Middle England. The hobbits are just the harmless country English who would never hurt a fly, but when great events come, they'll stand up and go off to war. It leaves a bad taste in my mouth, particularly now with all the anti-immigrant rhetoric and then the rise of nationalism. It's super uncomfortable. The England that Tolkien is talking about never existed. And even when something more closely to what he's harkening back to did exist, they weren't holed up in the Shire, not thinking about the outside world. They were sending their kids off to enforce the most brutal empire the world has ever seen. Let's not brush over that fact, The English are not innocent. And, that goes for the Welsh and the Scottish and as well. I'm Welsh. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not connected to that empire. The Welsh were enforcing it too, while also having our language stamped out at home. You can be the victim and the victimizer. You can be the bully and the bullied. In fact, the two almost always exist in the same identity, right? I don't like that. I don't like that kind of the uncomfortable nationalist vibes. But, I understand. I do see the appeal. I used to love it. I still do love it to a certain extent. It's also fine to grow out of stuff, You don't have to love everything you loved as a child forevermore to the same degree. You can still love it, but with more of a critical eye, and read some other stuff that maybe goes in different directions and doesn't have that uncomfortable stuff, I feel like I'm saying you a lot when I mean me. This is what I'm doing. Harrison is saying Tolkien's bridge to real experience is the Hobbits. You start in the Shire, which is recognisably an England that never really existed, but still recognisably English. And then they go off into the more mythological lands full of wizards and heroic men and orcs and elves and whatever. Here's Harrison talking about that. There we discover them to be unobtrusive but ancient, quoting Tolkien, lovers of peace and quiet and good-tilled earth, good-natured rather than beautiful of face, hearty eaters and drinkers, being fond of simple jests at all times and of 6 meals a day, but difficult to daunt or kill. And add to this that hackneyed spark of courage that flares eventually in the chest of even the fattest specimen, and you have the perfect stereotype of the common man beloved by Chesterton and the pre-World War I nationalists, the yeoman of England, something that doesn't exist and never did, the dependable, amiable peasant who doesn't quite understand great events, but is quietly willing to go out and do his bit. Those solid Englishmen went reluctantly to war and were pulverized at Ypres, dying messily and without nobility. In any rural pub, you can meet Samwise Gamgee's gaffer, swearing and spitting unpleasantly into the fire. I once worked in a Warwickshire hunting stable with an amiable rustic character who beat up his dog so often it wet itself every time he went near it. First of all, that's great writing. Amazing. And yeah, he's right. It's this uncomfortable nationalism, right? This is the problem with linking mythology to an ethnicity or a national identity when that identity is involved with empire and power. And the thing about the dog, that's really familiar. I feel like that comes up in some of Harrison's fiction, maybe in Climbers, which is a great book. Really recommend Climbers. It's his purely literary fiction book about climbing in North England. Harrison's really employing this passive voice. The narrative is almost like film. In the film, you can have what's on the camera be the narration, right? What you see can be symbolic and can be thought-provoking without having a narrator telling you what to think. That's what Harrison is really channeling in Climbers and in a lot of the stories and Things That Never Happen. Really cool. I feel like I was quite unfair about Harrison in the last video. I mentioned the capitalism v communism thing. I was mainly thinking of the Centauri device. It's unfair to only talk about that when it's a book he's mostly disowned. I just really didn't like it. The whole two sides thing, the Israel-Palestine conflict as well, that it really wasn't great. But although I could see how it influenced, say, like the space opera, V&M Banks and all that stuff, and there were some cool elements. But I think Harrison really develops this anti-ideology into this anti-mythologizing, being critical of the dominant narratives that we live our lives by, that are fed to us, that we then accept as truth and as the way the world has to be, the way that fantasy can define the world, which really reminds me of, I feel like he must be influenced by that Borges story, Tlön something and something Orbis. The story about it starts with two guys talking about encyclopedias and then ends with a fictional world becoming the world. Really cool story, and I think that sums up where Harrison's coming from with a lot of his anti-ideology stuff. Really cool. Yeah, loved these critical essays. Yeah, and Harrison talks about there's an element of Disney in Tolkien. Like Disney, Tolkien presents us with stability and comfort and safe catharsis. The Lord of the Rings is detailed enough to get lost in. It deals with good and evil, but avoids the riskier ethical questions. And most important, it ends where it begins, with almost everybody safe in the Shire, just a shade wiser and more appreciative of home. Any major change in Middle-earth brought about by the fall of Sauron goes on outside the Hobbit's area of sensibility. Indeed, the Shire is hermetically sealed by the new king. I love how Harrison's like referencing like the appendices. He's clearly like done a detailed reading of Lord of the Rings. The Shire is hermetically sealed by the new king, just in case its status quo is ever threatened again. Take away the cocoa cup and put on the nightlight. The reader ends the book like the hobbits in the house of Tom Bombadil, tucked up tight. Fear no nightly noises, the nursery doors locked, and none of the big people shall pass its borders. 50 years ago, just completely on point, I think. His last essay in New Worlds Quarterly 1 did feel a bit out of date because he was really trumpeting dystopia as the response to this comforting fantasy. But the comfort of dystopia has become a real thing, especially with young adult fantasy. So that has aged less well. This is perfect, yeah. And basically just worded how I was feeling about Lord of the Rings way better than I ever could. Worth getting these New Worlds Quarterlies just for Harrison's criticism, and Moorcock's introductions are really good as well. Both guys that are more into fantasy than science fiction. The new wave isn't just about science fiction. The author bios. Should we go through the author bios? Yeah, alright. Keith Roberts is the author of several fine SF and fantasy novels and a forthcoming historical novel, The Boat of Fate. His last story in New Worlds Quarterly was The God House, part of the same series as Monkey Pruensal, which in turn is part of a projected novel. That's quite a good way of describing a collection of connected short stories, isn't it? Whenever they mention like an upcoming novel, I'm just going to check that exists or what the actual name is, because sometimes that changes. Yep, The Boat of Fate, a historical novel by Keith Roberts, set in the late Roman Empire. Follows the life of a young Roman officer named Marcus who is stationed in Britain. I am definitely going to read this. Not to like risk being a stereotype, but I am interested in the history of Rome. Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast got me through the end of my PhD. I was losing my mind and needed to think about anything other than writing my thesis. Great podcast, and his Revolutions series is really good as well. He's actually been doing a fictional history of the revolution of Mars, which I listened to the first episode and it was good. I need to set aside time to go through it properly. But I think it's, inspired by Kim Stanley Robinson and all of the actual revolutions that Mike Duncan has been covering. So really cool way to do science fiction in terms of a historical podcast. So reading New Worlds Quarterly 1 and 2, Keith Roberts is the guy that I'm now completely sold on, as I'm going to be chasing him down. I really loved his writing. He seems like a prickly guy. He just didn't give a shit, he's doing his own thing, and that may have sabotaged his own career, but he wrote some good stories in the meantime. Norman Spinrad has been a regular contributor to New Worlds since his serial Budjack Baron appeared there and shocked British distributors so much they refused to handle it. This led to a question in the House of Commons concerning the story. Since then, Spinrad has written a number of short stories, including The Last Hurrah of the Golden Horde in number 191. He currently lives in California, where he's working on a sword and sorcery novel tentatively called Sword of the Third Reich. So that's the Iron Dream, right? Do I have that? Yeah, I actually have that right here. I haven't read this yet. This is probably the Spinrad I'm most excited to read. Just a satire of how fascist a lot of the sword and sorcery books were at the time. Really cool idea. Maybe a bit too big for what it needs to be, but I do find that a bit daunting. Yeah. Extremely funny idea for a book. What if Hitler was writing sword and sorcery? William Woodrow is a biologist who William Woodrow is definitely a pen name. Has that feel right? He's a biologist who contributed articles on ecology and natural history to Animals, Wildlife and the Countryside and The Countryman. This is his first published adult story. Sorry. This makes it sound like his other stuff was for kids. He lives in Rastrick, Yorkshire, and is currently working on a textbook of techniques in field ecology. He's an ecologist. That's the coolest science, ecology. I wasn't a big fan of his story. It looks like he wrote one more in New Worlds 4. So we'll see how that goes. But I don't think he had a career. M. John Harrison is literary editor of New Worlds Quarterly and is currently working on what he terms a new wave sword and sorcery novel, which will be published next year. His last story in New Worlds Quarterly was The Lamia and Lord Cromus. That's the Pastel City, which is great fun. It's a lot more schlocky than most of his stuff. I've started reading Storm of Wings, which I am taking my time with. It's almost like prose poetry. It's so dense. I think I mentioned in the last video I was fancying some schlocky fantasy, so I read one of the Forgotten Realms tie-in books, which was fine, but I do need good prose, even if it's really schlocky. I need the writing to be good, otherwise my eyes start drifting off the page. So I've been pushed to the opposite side of fantasy, and I'm navigating Storm of Wings, and I've got chronic fatigue, and it's quite bad right now, especially with the heat wave. It seems to trigger it. I'm wondering to myself, what have I done? Storm of Wings, is this the right time? I'm loving it so far. J.G. Ballard is a frequent contributor to New Worlds. He lives in Shepperton with his 3 children and a variety of pets, and recently completed his first novel since The Crystal World, serialized in New World as Equinox. His last stories in New Worlds Quarterly were A Place and a Time to Die, which was bad, and The Beach Murders. Wait, what? That's interesting. The 2 stories in New Worlds Quarterly 1 were A Journey Across a Crater and A Place and a Time to Die. But maybe that's only in the American version, the Berkeley science fiction. If anyone knows, let me know. I don't know. Is that interesting? I think it's kind of interesting. The confusing history of editions and versions and everything, just, I do find it kind of fascinating. New Worlds, like, the deeper you dig, the more confusing it seems to get. Barrington J. Bailey currently lives in Shropshire and is the author of 2 SF novels, one of which is still to be published by Ace Books, New York, under the name P.F. Woods. He has been contributing to New Worlds for nearly 10 years. His last story in New Worlds Quarterly was Exit from City 5, which I did enjoy. Alright, that's cool. P.F. Woods, keeping an eye out for that. That's his pen name. Bailey, definitely another name that I was aware of, like Keith Roberts. I'd heard of him, but having read his stories in the last 2 New Worlds Quarterlies, I'm into him. I'm going to be checking him out. There aren't many people who can do the wacky stuff and not turn me off, but I think Bailey is weird enough and makes it uncomfortable enough that I find it interesting still. Peter Tate lives in Cardiff, that's where I'm from, and works on a Welsh daily newspaper. His first novel, The Thinking Seat, has recently been published by Faber and Faber and Doubleday, an expansion of the story originally published in New Worlds. I bet that Welsh daily newspaper is the South Wales Echo. That's really funny that he's writing for the Echo. That always reminds me of, I never met the bird, but there are always stories in my family of my great aunt having a minor bird that she bought off a guy who sold the South Wales Echo, that she would just cover up the cage to shut it up when guests came round, but it would still talk from as if from nowhere in this really low voice, just being like, "Echo, get the South Wales Echo." That's probably not interesting, but anyway, just the things that bubble to the surface. Right. Yeah, Peter Tate, his story, it didn't like wow me, but I was quite interested in what he was trying to do like a Shakespearean SF thing, but not just redoing a Shakespeare story. And it was really well written. It did feel a bit like an early story of a writer who becomes better. So I am very interested in checking out his other stuff. Again, that book about the Welsh separatists discovering the nerve gas cache, I think I want to check that one out the most. I looked at them recently. Someone on Instagram, Hall of Machines, who's always reading good shit, posted a load of Peter Tate covers, and they're all banging. Like, George Zebrowski has contributed to Galaxy, If, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Infinity One, and others. He lives in New York State and is the editor of the Bulletin of Science Fiction Writers of America. Oh, he's ensconced in the science fiction establishment. Jack Dann has contributed to, among other things, Damon Knight's Orbit collections. So Orbit, yeah, obviously I've been hating on Dangerous Visions, but Orbit I'm more interested in. Damon Knight's Orbit sounds good. That seems to be full of the new wave authors that I really like Joanna Russ, and is he kind of new? He's kind of new wave. Gene Wolfe, he's doing his own thing, but like definitely got the literary influence and all that stuff, postmodern vibes. So yeah, I want to check out Orbit. I don't think I'm going to read all of them. There's so many, but I might try and track down some of the ones that are meant to be better and have a go at them. Thomas M. Disch is currently living in Europe. His last contribution to New Worlds Quarterly was Angoulême, which was amazing. His story in here was good, a little satire about sentimental stories or whatever. But Angoulême was incredible. His novels Echo Round His Bones, which sounds cool, and Camp Concentration, which I love. It's one of my favorite books, actually, were originally serialized in New Worlds. I didn't know that. That's good to know. Michael Coney is at present trying to manage a hotel and nightclub in Antigua, West Indies. Okay. And began selling SF stories in 1968. He has appeared in New Writings in SF, which is another one people talk about, right? I'm not sure if I'm as interested in that. And Galaxy. Barry Malzberg bigs up Galaxy a lot if you watch his interviews, which does kind of interest me. Maybe I'll try and find a best of Galaxy or something. Although I'm not entirely sure if... I feel like Barry Malzberg is the kind of guy who... He glorifies the 50s SF he grew out of, but he's heads and shoulders over that stuff, you know? Just want to shout out to Bookpilled for introducing me to Barry Malzberg. He's quickly become one of my favorite authors. Incredible. Overlay, man. Overlay. What a book. Michael Coney, I did really enjoy reading that story. I felt like the end was a bit predictable, could have been better, but the writing was top-notch. So I'm very interested in checking out Coney. He seems to have written quite a few books, but it's like more critically acclaimed ones seem to be really hard to find. Like, is it Hello, Summer, Goodbye? That sounds really good, but I think I'm going to have to be pirating that one. Rachel Pollack is 25 and teaches English at the State University of New York at Plattsburgh. Pandora's Bust is her first publication. I could take or leave Pandora's Bust. It was fine. Yeah, it's funny, like, when you can recognize you would enjoy something more in a different format, right? If it was a comic, I think I would have enjoyed it more. And I know she is big in comics, like through Doom Patrol and that sort of thing. So I am interested in checking out some of that stuff, maybe. So, New Worlds Quarterly 2. Definitely an anthology of two halves, I think. The first half, you got Moorcock, Roberts, Spinrad, Woodrow, probably the worst in the collection, Harrison, Ballard, Bailey. All their stories are good, and the Roberts and Harrison ones are great. Sorry, the Ballad is criticism of Wyndham Lewis. It's not a short story, although it read kind of like a short story, which was cool. Has Ballard got a thing for reviewing like fascists in New Worlds? Like, he reviewed Mein Kampf, right? In New Worlds in the 60s at some point, as if it was a science fiction novel. Is that right? I'm never going to read Mein Kampf, but I am tempted to read the Ballad review of Mein Kampf. Probably feel the same about Wyndham Lewis. I think I'm quite happy to have read that review. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should check him out. But I get why they're reviewing Wyndham Lewis, right? Because he's an avant-garde guy. That's kind of what New Worlds is about, right? They're doing avant-garde literature under the guise of, in sheep's clothing, of SF. They have to reckon with the British heritage of the avant-garde, which means taking a look at Wyndham Lewis. That was really cool. I really enjoyed that. I'm loving the criticism. Like, the quality of the criticism is so high. Like, Ballard and Harrison really know what they're doing. Yeah, love it. Loved the first half of this. The second half, Tate, Zebrowski and Dann, Disch, Coney, Pollack, Sellings. It was middling. The second half was very middling. It was very top heavy, this collection. And it has made me a bit reticent to jump straight into the next one. I think I'm going to be weaving the New Worlds quarterlies with some other anthologies. Otherwise, I will just drive myself mad, I think. I won't enjoy them as much if I'm just powering through them. It would be better to pepper them amongst other things. The good stories in New Worlds Quarterly 1 were better, but more of them were reprints from older New Worlds issues. Although saying that, the best stories in there were Angoulême and the Godhouse, and they were newly printed in that issue. So, yeah, don't know what I'm talking about. There were a couple of reprints in here. The Peter Tate was a reprint. I think the Arthur Sellings was... I don't know if that's just filling up space. Who knows? But, yeah. Monkey Prudence was... and The Causeway. Four Color Problem, probably my favourites. I'm definitely not going to be raving about this one as much, you know. Interested to see how the recurring characters develop and whether there are some more relatively unknown names, at least to me, that pop up that are really good. But yeah. Hello, my battery died again. I was like a minute away from finishing, so I'll just carry on. I think what most disappoints me about these New Worlds quarterlies, and this isn't a big thing at all, but there are a few of what Moorcock describes as conventional SF, and they tend to be bad. That those stories tend to be not very good. I think he might be paying lip service to any legacy fans still reading from the pre-Moorcock editorship days when the magazine was more golden age. I think that's probably what's going on. I think Moorcock is also giving the reader a heads up that you can actually just skip those stories. So in his introductions, if he's like, hey, these are conventional SF, they're probably not worth reading. If you're interested in New Worlds, you're probably not interested in those stories. So that's the only thing, really. Other than that, I think it's quite cool what they're doing. I'm still very excited about New Worlds and the quarterly anthologies as a place for experimentation. Not everything is working, as is the case with experiments, you know, but there's some really interesting stuff going on. Reading these stories feels like you're at the bleeding edge of the new wave in the early 70s, which is fascinating to me. I like reading science fiction that's having an identity crisis, you know. It's trying to be more than the expected limitations of the genre, which is cool. I probably won't jump straight into New Worlds Quarterly 3. I feel like if I do that right now, I think I won't enjoy it as much. I want to spread these out and pepper them between some other anthologies. I hope the format's working. I kind of wanted the passage of time to be a noticeable element to these reviews, but more than that, I just wanted to give a lot of time to reviewing each individual story. I think YouTube is more focused towards reviewing novels, and the way those novels are reviewed as discrete objects tends to be the method for reviewing short story collections. Everything's lumped in with the same basket, which isn't really fair to individual stories, especially when you've got different authors, you know, in anthologies. So I'm keen to keep reviewing the stories individually, but I may like mess with the exact way I'm doing that. I don't know. I don't want it to seem like you're just vicariously reading through me, which, I mean, maybe that's what all criticism is like to a certain extent. Not that I'm doing criticism. This is, I've got takes. Go elsewhere if you want quality. Also, my approach to this currently is just turning on the camera, rambling, and trying to make sense of it. After cutting out all of my stammering and hesitations and interruptions from my illness, try and string it together into a cogent argument if it's possible. Maybe that's not working, who knows. I'm just going to carry on, and hopefully I get better. And in the meantime, hopefully it's vaguely interesting. It is really fun trying to cohere my thinking. I think that's all I've got to say, so I will catch you next time for something a little bit different. I will try and get outside and do some filming. It has been either too hot or too stormy to do that the past week or two, so that's why I've been holed up in my living room like the hermit I am. But yeah, hope you're doing well. Catch you next time.